Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are not just looking at a biography. We're really dissecting a miracle.
Or maybe, depending on how you look at it, a very calculated, very disciplined, and yeah, occasionally ruthless machine.
We're looking at a man who stood on, a swampy, malaria-infested island with absolutely zero natural resources.
Nothing.
We're talking not even enough fresh water to keep the population alive. And he just decides he's going to force it to become a first world metropolis.
It's a story that sort of defies the standard laws of post-colonial physics. I mean, if you run the simulation of the 20th century 100 times, Singapore fails in 99 of them.
Right.
Usually the story goes something like this. Charismatic revolutionary wins in attendance, the crowds cheer, the flag goes up, and then the country just slowly slides into corruption or civil war or, economic irrelevance.
The classic winning the war but losing the peace scenario.
Exactly. But this story is the inverse of that. It involves a man who didn't even want independence. He actually fought tooth and nail against it.
Yeah, that's the crazy part.
But when it was thrust upon him, he built one of the most hyper-efficient, wealthy, and controversial nation-states in history.
We are, of course, talking about the founding father of modern Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. And the stack of sources we have for this deep dive is, well, it's honestly a little intimidating. We've got biographical dossiers, declassified intelligence documents, transcripts of radio speeches, even some very recent government gazettes from just last month, December 2025.
It is a massive topic, but to really understand Lee Kuan Yew, you can't start with the gleaming skyline or the crazy rich Asians aesthetic we see today. You have to start with a moment of absolute trauma.
The weeping.
The weeping.
If you go to YouTube right now and you search his name, I guarantee the first clip you'll see is from August 9th, 1965. It's a press conference.
He's 41 years old.
Yeah, just 41. He's wearing that simple, open-collared white shirt, and he breaks down. He can't speak. He's physically wiping away tears on national television.
And we need to be very, very clear for anyone watching that clip. These are not tears of joy. This isn't a "we did it" moment of triumph.
No.
He calls it a moment of anguish.
He struggles to get the words out, but he says, "For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life I have believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories." He just announced that Singapore was being kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia.
Kicked out.
In his mind, he had failed. He thought Singapore was a dead man walking.
And that is the hook. Everything that Singapore is today, the financial hub, the obsessive safety, the clean streets, the obsession with reserves, it's all a direct overcompensation for that specific moment of vulnerability.
Wow.
The entire national psyche was forged in the trauma of that rejection. Lee Kuan Yew spent the rest of his life completely obsessed with one word: survival.
So our mission today is to reverse engineer that survival. How do you go from weeping on national TV, believing your country is totally doomed, to becoming this global sage who advised U.S. presidents from Nixon to Obama and Chinese leaders from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping?
It's an incredible arc.
We're going to look at the man, the methods, which were often incredibly harsh, and of course the legacy.
And to do that, we have to rewind the clock way back. Before he was the father of Singapore, and long before he was the scary authoritarian figure, he was just Harry.
Harry Lee. That name alone tells you so much about his starting point, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
He was born in 1923, a third-generation Peranakan Chinese. Now, we see that term Peranakan a lot in the notes. Let's unpack that because it explains his initial disconnect with the people he later led.
It's a crucial distinction. Peranakan means straits-born. His family had been in the region for a long time. They were deeply, deeply acculturated to the British Empire.
So not like the new immigrants from China.
Not at all. They didn't speak Mandarin at home. They spoke English, Malay, and a dialect called Baba Malay. They wore Western clothes. They played cricket.
His grandfather, Lee Hoon Leong, was the one who gave him the name Harry. He worked as a purser on British steamships and was a huge admirer of the British establishment. He wanted his grandson to be basically an English gentleman.
Right. So Lee Kuan Yew was what they called an Anglophile. He grew up singing "God Save the King." And in fact, and this usually blows people's minds, he didn't learn to speak Chinese until he was 32 years old.
32. That just seems like a massive political handicap if you're trying to lead a population that is majority Chinese immigrant.
Oh, it was a huge liability. When he eventually entered politics, his opponents mocked him constantly. They called him a banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside.
It's because he wasn't one of them.
Exactly. He had to work incredibly hard later in life to master Mandarin and Hokkien just so he could talk to the rickshaw pullers and the port workers without a translator. It wasn't natural talent. It was just a calculated necessity to survive politically.
And what about the family dynamic? It sounds like his childhood wasn't exactly a bed of roses. His father, Lee Kuan, he worked for Shell, but had a serious gambling addiction.
Yeah, he was a classic case of the charming but destructive father. He had a nasty temper, often violent, and he just blew the family's money on the tables. Very distant.
But his mother, Chua Jimnio, she was the steel in the family. She was the one who stood up to the father, managed the finances, and really kept the family afloat. Lee later credited her for his resilience.
He saw a very clear lesson right there at the dinner table. If you want things to run correctly, you have to be disciplined because chaos, like his father's gambling, it just destroys everything.
That desire for order over chaos.
That is the through line of his entire political philosophy. He never, ever trusted that things would just work out. He believed you had to make them work out.
But if his mother gave him the resilience, then World War II gave him the worldview. I mean, we cannot overstate how important the Japanese occupation of Singapore was to making Lee Kuan Yew who he became.
This is the crucible. No question. It's 1942. The British, who were supposed to be these invincible masters, the protectors of the realm, they surrendered Singapore to the Japanese Imperial Army in just 70 days.
70 days. Lee called it 70 days of surprises, upsets, and stupidities.
You have to imagine the psychological shock of that. The locals looked up to the British. They were the superior white man in the whole colonial hierarchy, and then they just collapsed. They couldn't fight. They couldn't protect the civilians.
It just shattered the myth.
Completely. Lee realized right then and there that the British had no divine right to rule. They had failed the most basic contract of governance, protection. He said later, "No one, neither Japanese nor British, had the right to push and kick us around."
And that's the seed of independence.
Yes, but it wasn't born from high-minded liberal idealism. It was born from pure anger at incompetence.
And he almost didn't survive to do anything about it. There's this story about the Suk Ching massacre that, I mean, it still gives me chills. This is a legitimate sliding doors moment for the entire 20th century.
It really is. The Japanese military police, the Kempeitai, they were rounding up Chinese men to screen them for anti-Japanese sentiment. It was arbitrary. It was brutal.
And they were looking for anyone with influence.
Right. Volunteers, civil servants, teachers. So Lee went to the screening center at Jalan Bazaar. He stood in line.
And as he's standing there, he just senses something is wrong. He sees the men being herded onto these trucks.
His survival instincts kicked in. I mean, they must have been screaming at him. He knew he should not get on those trucks. So he walked up to the Japanese guards and used a very mundane, bureaucratic excuse. He said, "I've left my clothes behind. Can I go home and get them?"
And the guard just let him go.
The guard just waved him off. Lee went home, hid in his room, didn't come out for days. The group he was standing with, the men who got on those trucks, they were driven to the beach at Changi and machine-gunned. He survived by a hair's breadth.
That is just terrifying. And then talk about pragmatism. He spends the rest of the war working for the Japanese.
This is what separates Lee from your typical romantic revolutionary, right?
No.
He didn't run into the jungle to fight a guerrilla war, no. He learned Japanese. He got a job in their propaganda department, the Hujibu, because he was translating Allied radio intercepts. He wanted to know what was really happening in the war. He wanted information.
He also ran a black market business making glue called stickfuss.
Yes, stickfuss. Because the Japanese war economy was so bad, there was no glue. So Lee, the future statesman, is in his kitchen boiling tapioca to make adhesive.
He was a hustler.
A total hustler. But that period taught him that power is raw. It's not about constitutions or rights. It's about who has the gun and who has the food. He saw the brutality of the Japanese, especially the Kempeitai, but he also weirdly respected their discipline. He internalized that ruthlessness.
So the war ends, the British return, and Lee goes off to the UK. He crushes it at Cambridge double first-class honors, the star student. But he returns to Singapore in 1950 not as a loyal subject, but as a man with a plan.
He becomes a lawyer. But he doesn't join some fancy firm to make millions. No, he starts representing the trade unions and the postal workers.
Which is just a brilliant pivot. Here's this Cambridge-educated elite wearing a suit, but he's fighting for the guys in the sweaty singlets.
He was building a power base. That's what it was. He was bridging the gap between his English-educated circle, the bourgeoisie, and the Chinese-speaking working class who actually had the numbers. And this leads directly to the formation of the PAP, the People's Action Party, in the basement of his house in 1954.
And this brings us to what you could call the marriage of convenience. Because the PIP wasn't just Harry Lee and his moderate friends, was it?
No, not at all. This is the part that gets scrubbed from some of the simpler history books. Lee Kuan Yew knew he couldn't win the masses alone. He couldn't speak to them effectively yet. So he allied with the pro-communists, led by this incredibly charismatic young firebrand named Lin Chin-strong.
So you have the bourgeoisie lawyers on one side and the hard-left trade unionists on the other. That just seems like a recipe for disaster.
They hated each other ideologically. Lee called it riding the tiger. He knew the communists wanted to use him as a respectable frontman to avoid getting arrested by the British, and he wanted to use their street cred to get votes.
Both sides thought they could outsmart the other in the end.
Exactly. It was a high-stakes game of political chicken.
Spoiler alert, Lee won. In 1959, the PFP wins a landslide election. Singapore becomes self-governing, and Lee Kuan Yew becomes the first prime minister. And immediately, that Puritan streak comes out.
Oh, instantly. He launches what he called the anti-yellow culture drive. Yellow culture was his term for anything decadent, Western, or morally loose.
I love the list of things he went after. He banned jukeboxes.
Jukebox.
He raided places selling pornography. He cracked down on long hair on men. Literally, if you had long hair, you were served last at government offices.
It sounds kind of funny now, but the message was deadly serious. The party is over. We have a country to build. He banned jukeboxes because he thought they encouraged idling, loafing around. He wanted a population that was working, studying, or sleeping. That's it.
He even introduced air conditioning to government offices, but not for comfort, for efficiency. And then he slashed civil service salaries to balance the budget.
He was signaling that leadership was about sacrifice. But look, the biggest issue on his mind wasn't jukeboxes. It was the existential question. We need to remind you, Singapore in 1959 was not viewed as a viable country.
Not by anyone. It was a port city with no hinterland. It imported its water, its food, its construction material, everything.
Lee believed, quite logically, that an independent Singapore was a complete absurdity. It was like imagining New York City trying to be a country without the rest of the United States. It had to be part of the larger Malayan Federation.
So his entire political platform was merger. We must join Malaya. And this brings us to the battle for merger. This wasn't just backroom deals. He took his case directly to the people.
He gave 12 radio speeches. These are legendary in Singaporean history. He explained in agonizing detail why the communists were wrong and why merger was the only path. He spoke directly to the people in multiple languages, bypassing the left-wing press. It was a masterclass in political communication.
But he didn't just use words, he used the knuckle duster, as he would say. We have to talk about Operation Cold Store in 1963.
Yes. This is where the authoritarian label really begins to stick. By 1963, that marriage of convenience with the communists had totally collapsed. They broke away to form the Barisan Socialist Party.
And they were strong.
Very strong. They could have won the next election.
So what does Lee do? He arrests them.
February 1963, a massive dragnet. Over 100 arrests. Left-wing activists, opposition leaders, newspaper editors, and his old ally Lim Chin Siong. They were all detained without trial under the Preservation of Public Security Ordinance.
Now, Lee's official line was that he was reluctant to do it, that the British and Malayans forced his hand to ensure security before the merger could happen.
That's the official narrative, but declassified documents. Well, they suggest Lee was actually quite enthusiastic. He needed to clear the board. He decapitated the opposition leadership right before the election.
So whether they were a violent threat or just a political threat is still debated.
It is. But the result was clear. The PIP won, and the left was crushed.
So the board is cleared. Merger happens. Malaysia is formed in 1963. Mission accomplished.
For about 2 years, it was a disaster from day one.
A total clash of ideologies that just couldn't be reconciled. Lee Kuan Yew wanted a Malaysian Malaysia.
Which sounds nice and inclusive, but it was political dynamite in that context. He meant a meritocracy where race didn't determine your political standing. But the federal government in Kuala Lumpur, led by the UMNO party, wanted a Malaysia where Malay political supremacy was enshrined in the system.
They saw Lee's call for equality as a direct challenge.
A challenge to their special constitutional rights. Tensions escalated fast. You had the 1964 race riots in Singapore. People died. It was incredibly ugly.
And then came the moment that probably sealed Singapore's fate. Lee Kuan Yew went to the Malaysian parliament in Kuala Lumpur and gave a speech. But he didn't just give a speech.
No, he spoke in flawless Malay.
He went into the lion's den and spoke their language better than some of them did.
Exactly. He outdebated the Malay leadership in their own tongue. And this didn't impress them. It terrified them. They realized this man wasn't just some nuisance mayor of Singapore. He was a potential prime minister of the whole federation. He could appeal to everyone.
So Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Malaysian prime minister, basically decided he's got to go.
Hived off. That was the term they used. They decided to just cut Singapore loose. The calculation was that Singapore would fail on its own and come crawling back on Malaysia's terms later.
Which brings us right back to that weeping man on TV. August 9th, 1965. Singapore is independent, unwillingly. And Lee Kuan Yew is staring at a country with no army, no economy, and hostile neighbors.
This is the pivot point. The third world to first journey begins right here. And it starts with the economy, which is about to just fall off a cliff.
Right, because in 1967, the British announced they were pulling their military bases out, and that was something like 20% of Singapore's GNP.
It should have been a death sentence. But this is where Lee Kuan Yew and his team, specifically Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the economic architect, did something radical. I mean, you have to understand the context of the 60s. Most developing countries were anti-Western.
Right, they were nationalizing industries, kicking out foreign companies.
Neocolonialism was the enemy.
And Lee does the exact opposite.
He pivots 180 degrees. He says, we have no domestic market. We need the world. So he aggressively courted multinational corporations, the MNCs. He told the Americans and the Japanese, come here, set up your factories. We will be cheaper, safer, and more reliable than anyone else.
He practically laid out the red carpet for them, built the infrastructure, guaranteed the rule of law. But to make it safer, he had to do something the unions really didn't like.
He brought the unions to heel. He basically said you can have jobs or you can have strikes. You can't have both. He passed laws that made strikes illegal in essential services. He disciplined the workforce to be attractive to foreign capital.
It was a trade-off.
A huge one. Suppression of labor rights in exchange for rapid employment.
And it worked. Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, they all came. Singapore became a manufacturing hub.
But you can't have investment without security. And Singapore was surrounded by big neighbors, Indonesia and Malaysia, who weren't exactly friendly. Indonesia was actually waging a low-level conflict called konfrontasi, setting off bombs in Singapore.
So he had to build an army from scratch. And here's a detail that I find fascinating, and it shows just how pragmatic he was. He asked for help to train his army. The British were leaving. India refused. Egypt refused. Who did he ask?
Israel.
Israel. But he couldn't tell the neighbors, hey, the Israelis are training us. Because Singapore is surrounded by Muslim countries. That would have caused a geopolitical firestorm. So what do they call the Israeli military advisors?
Mexicans.
Mexicans? I mean, can you imagine that? Oh, these guys, just some tanning military consultants from, Mexico City.
It's hilarious in hindsight, but it was deadly serious. He took help from Israel because they were the only ones who knew how to defend a small, surrounded nation with a conscript army. And he instituted national service mandatory conscription to make sure every single man had a stake in defending the country.
Now, let's talk about the visual aspect of this transformation.
Yeah.
The Garden City. Because I always thought the trees in Singapore were just nice, for aesthetics.
Oh, no. With Lee Kuan Yew, nothing is ever just aesthetics. Everything is strategy.
He was obsessed with greenery. He launched tree planting campaigns in the 60s. He personally chose the types of creepers to cover concrete flyovers just to hide the gray.
And why? Because he wanted to send a subconscious signal to investors. He reasoned that if a city in the sweltering tropics could be kept green, manicured, and orderly, it proved that the government was disciplined. It proved the workforce was disciplined. It was branding.
First world standards in a third world region.
Precisely. And that extends to what he called the most important invention of the 20th century.
Don't tell me. The internet.
Air conditioning.
He really said that.
Dead serious. He believed you couldn't have high mental productivity in the tropics without climate control. He made sure civil service buildings were AC'd so people could think clearly. He was an environmental engineer of the highest order.
So we have the economy, we have the army, we have the trees. But to truly will a nation into existence, you have to mold the people. And this is where we get into the nanny state territory. This is the stuff that makes Western liberals very, very uncomfortable. But we need to look at it through his eyes.
Lew didn't just want to govern the state. He wanted to engineer the society. He believed that the government's job was to maximize the potential of the population, even if that meant, well, interfering in their private lives.
Let's start with housing, the HDB.
Right. When the PAP took over, people were living in these squatter settlements with open sewers. Lee embarked on a massive public housing program. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats.
But the genius wasn't just building them.
No, the genius was allowing people to use their pension funds, the CPF, to buy these flats. He wanted a nation of homeowners.
Because if you own property, you have a stake in the country. You're not going to riot and burn down your own block of flats. It was social stability through real estate. It anchored a rootless immigrant population to the island. But then he gets into the bedroom. Literally. Let's talk about population control.
The pendulum swing here is just wild. In the 60s and 70s, the fear was overpopulation, so the slogan was, "Stop at 2." They penalized families for having more children, they taxed them higher, they gave them lower priority for schools.
But then, in the 80s, Lee looks at the census data and panics. He realizes that the educated women, the university graduates, they aren't having kids, while the less educated are having big families.
And this reveals a core and very controversial part of his worldview, eugenics. He believed that intelligence was 80% genetic. He famously said that if the smart people don't breed, the society will become stupid and the economy will collapse.
That is candid and incredibly offensive to a lot of people.
It's hard truths, as he would call it. He didn't care if it was offensive. He cared if it was true, according to his data. So he launches the Great Marriage Debate. He sets up a government matchmaking agency essentially for graduates. And then the Graduate Mothers Scheme.
This was the policy where graduate mothers got tax rebates and priority for their kids in schools.
It was a complete disaster. It was wildly unpopular. It cost the PAP a 12.9% swing in the 1984 elections. People felt it was unfair, elitist, and just plain wrong.
So they pushed back.
They pushed back hard. The government actually had to roll it back. It's one of the few times Lee reached a limit on how much he could socially engineer the populace.
But he never backed down on discipline. Corporal punishment, caning.
No, he was a staunch defender of it. He believed that for a society to be free, it first had to be orderly. And if that meant caning vandals, so be it.
Which brings us to the Michael Fay incident in 1994. An American teenager vandalizes cars with spray paint. The U.S. president, Bill Clinton, asks for leniency.
And Singapore says no. Well, they reduced the strokes from 6 to 4 as a gesture, but they still caned him. It was a message to the world. Our laws apply to everyone, and we don't care if you're an American or if the U.S. president calls.
It was the ultimate clash of Asian values versus Western liberalism.
Lee argued that the Western focus on individual rights led to decay drugs, crime, broken families. He championed so-called Asian values community over self, order over liberty. He'd just point to the safe streets of Singapore and say, "This is the result of my way."
And part of that order was zero tolerance for corruption.
This is arguably his greatest achievement. Most post-colonial nations just drown in corruption. Lee kept Singapore clean. How? By giving the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, the CPIB, absolute power.
Power to arrest anyone.
Anyone. To investigate bank accounts, to look into families, and the other side of the coin, paying ministers huge salaries.
Right, that was the carrot.
The logic was, pay them like CEOs so they aren't tempted by bribes. But the stick was ruthless punishment. There's the tragic case of Tess Ching Wan, the Minister for National Development. He was a close colleague of Lee's, a founding member. In 1986, he was investigated for accepting bribes.
And he wrote a letter to Lee Kuan Yew and then committed suicide.
Lee Kuan Yew's response was chilling, but completely consistent. He published the letter. He didn't cover it up to save the party's face. He read it in Parliament. He showed that no one, not even his closest friends, was above the law. It reinforced the system's integrity, even at the cost of a friend's life.
Let's pivot to the global stage. By the 70s and 80s, Lee isn't just a local leader. He's become a geopolitical sage.
He positioned himself as the China whisperer.
Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore in 1978.
This is a historic turning point. Deng looks at Singapore, this clean, prosperous, orderly city run by ethnic Chinese, and he's just stunned. He realizes that China, under Mao's communism, had fallen so far behind. He goes back to Beijing and basically says, we need to do what Singapore did.
So Lee Kuan Yew essentially provided the blueprint for modern China's economy.
In many ways, yes. And because of that, he was the only person who could walk into the White House and explain China to the Americans, and then walk into Zondanhai and explain America to the Chinese. He was the ultimate translator of East-West power dynamics.
He supported the U.S. in Vietnam, which surprises some people given his non-aligned stance.
He was a pure realist. He knew the U.S. would probably lose, but he wanted them to stay as long as possible. He said the war bought time for the rest of Southeast Asia to stabilize and not fall to communism. He was buying a firewall of time for Singapore to mature.
But for all this international acclaim, at home, he was tough on the press.
Tough is putting it mildly. He sued them repeatedly. The Far Eastern Economic Review, the International Herald Tribune, opposition politician J.B. Jeyaretnam. If you defamed him or impugned his integrity, he would take you to court and, very often, bankrupt you.
He didn't believe in a crusading press.
No, he told Charlie Rose once, "I believe in truth." But to him, the truth was that the press shouldn't be a political player. They should report, not set the agenda. He saw the Western media as arrogant, trying to impose their values on his society. It created a climate where the press knew exactly where the out-of-bounds markers were.
As he got older, he stepped down as PM in 1990, but stayed on as senior minister, then minister mentor. He never really left the stage until the very end.
And he kept being provocative. In 2011, he released the book Hard Truths, and he made comments about Islam and integration that were so controversial. His own son, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, had to publicly distance the government from them.
He just didn't have a filter for what we'd call political correctness.
He didn't care about being polite. He cared about stating what he saw as the facts, however uncomfortable. He was worried that the younger generation was taking Singapore's success for granted, that they were becoming soft.
We have to talk about his final years, and specifically his house, 38 Oxley Road. This story has taken a major turn very, very recently.
The irony of this whole house situation is just, it's heavy.
So Lee Kuan Yew hated personality cults. He didn't want statues, he didn't want shrines. And he explicitly stated in his will that his home, a simple pre-war bungalow at 38 Oxley Road, should be demolished after his death.
He wanted it gone. He didn't want it to become a place of pilgrimage. He wanted the land returned to the state or redeveloped. He was completely unsentimental about bricks and mortar. He was worried it would fall into disrepair.
But here we are. It's January 18, 2026. And just last month, on December 12, 2025, the government officially gazetted the site as a national monument.
Right. For years, there was a stalemate because his daughter, Dr. Lu Wei-ling, was still living there. But after she passed away recently, the legal hurdles cleared and the government moved to preserve it. They argued it has too much historical significance. I mean, the basement is where the PFU was formed. It's where independent strategies were hatched.
So the man who planned everything, who controlled every aspect of Singapore's development, couldn't control the fate of his own living room.
It symbolizes the tension between the man and the myth. The nation he built feels a need to own his legacy, even if it contradicts his personal wish for privacy. It's the state acting in what it sees as the national interest over the individual, which, ironically, is exactly the philosophy Lee Kuan Yew taught them.
That is... wow. That's a paradox wrapped in an irony.
It really is. He trained them too well.
So, let's try to wrap this up. We've looked at the weeping man, the street fighter, the economic architect, the social engineer. What's this summation here?
Lee Kuan Yew was not a Democrat in the Western sense. He never pretended to be. He was a pragmatist. He traded civil liberties for economic survival and social order. He famously said, "I am not interested in political theory. I am interested in what works."
And it worked. The data is undeniable. GDP, life expectancy, homeownership, it all just skyrocketed.
Yeah.
He took a place with no future and gave it a future.
But he was also a knuckle-duster politician. He neutralized his enemies ruthlessly. He created a sterile political environment, and he left a legacy that is incredibly hard to follow.
Here's a final thought I want to leave with you, the listener. Lee Kuan Yew built a nation of educated, critical thinkers. He built a first-world economy. But in doing so, did he create a society that eventually outgrew the need for his style of leadership?
That is the big question, isn't it? Could a Lee Kuan Yew exist in the Singapore of 2026? Could you run a modern, hyper-connected, educated populace with that same iron fist? Or was he a man for a specific season, a crisis leader who was necessary then, but would be impossible now?
That is definitely something to chew on. If you want to see the intensity of the man yourself, go to YouTube and look up the Battle for Merger speeches or that 1965 press conference. Watch his eyes. You'll see exactly what we're talking about.
It's history in the raw.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the giant of Southeast Asia. We'll see you next time.